Did Johnny Carson's famous couch expose Hollywood charm or hide something much darker? For 30 years, America watched legends smile, laugh, flirt, and tell polished stories under those Tonight Show lights. But behind the glamour, some golden age icons carried reputations filled with cruelty, ego, disturbing allegations, and behavior the public rarely saw. Carson never needed to shout it. Sometimes, the silence after the applause said everything. Before we begin, one thing matters. There is no proven official document where Johnny Carson publicly released a list of evil guests. But his show became the place where old Hollywood had to perform one more time in front of America. And when legends sat across from Carson, viewers saw charm. Staff saw pressure. History later saw patterns. These are 9 Golden Age figures whose public images clashed sharply with darker stories, controversial reputations, and accounts that made fans question who they were really applauding. Number 9. Jane Russell. Jane Russell looked like old Hollywood confidence carved into human form. In the 40s and 50s, she became one of the screen's most recognizable symbols of glamour, beauty, and boldness. By the time she entered the late-night era, she was not just an actress anymore. She was a survivor of the studio system, a woman who had lived through publicity machines, moral panic, and fame's sharpest teeth. But that polished image came with a harder edge. Russell was outspoken, deeply opinionated, and not always easy to separate from the social attitudes of her era. In a softer nostalgia piece, she would be remembered only as a glamorous star from The Outlaw and Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. But a darker version of the story asks a different question. What happens when an icon's charm is wrapped around beliefs and behavior that feel cruel to people standing outside her circle? That is why she fits this list. Not because she was a movie villain, but because Hollywood often forgave legends for things ordinary people could never get away with. On camera, she represented glamour. Off camera, her reputation reminds us that beauty and kindness were never the same thing. Number 8. Shelley Winters. Shelley Winters did not enter a room quietly. She arrived like weather. Loud, emotional, political, funny, wounded, furious, and impossible to ignore. To some viewers, that made her magnetic. To others, it made her exhausting. Carson's show worked best when guests understood rhythm. Joke, story, laugh, commercial. Winters did not always obey rhythm. She brought storms. That is what made her dangerous television. Unlike guests who hid behind perfect manners, Winters often seemed incapable of pretending for too long. If she was angry, the room felt it. If she disliked someone, the audience could sense it. If a conversation turned shallow, she had the power to drag it into something raw and uncomfortable. But here is the twist. Winters may be one of the least evil people on this list. Her problem was not cold calculation, it was volatility. She could turn a light entertainment moment into a confrontation because she cared too loudly, reacted too quickly, and refused to shrink herself for anyone's comfort. In old Hollywood, that made her difficult. On Carson's couch, it made her unpredictable. And in television, unpredictability can feel thrilling for viewers, but terrifying for everyone trying to keep the show from falling apart. Number 7. Zsa Zsa Gabor. Zsa Zsa Gabor understood celebrity before celebrity became an industry. She did not need a role, a hit film, or a dramatic comeback to command attention. She simply had to appear, smile, say "darling," and turn the entire room into her stage. To viewers, she was playful glamour. To producers, she could be a scheduling headache wrapped in diamonds. The darker side of Zsa Zsa was not violence or scandal in the same sense as others on this list. It was entitlement. She represented the guest who knew the camera loved her and used that knowledge like a crown. Special treatment, attention, beauty, control, these were not extras in her world. They were expected, and that is where charm becomes dangerous. A diva can be funny from a distance, but exhausting up close. When one person's comfort becomes more important than the crew, the timing, the other guests, and the people paid to keep everything running, glamour starts to look less magical and more selfish. Carson knew how to handle big personalities, but Zsa Zsa was not just a personality. She was a brand, a performance, and a demand all at once. America laughed. The staff probably checked the clock. Number 6. Mickey Rooney. Mickey Rooney was supposed to be nostalgia in human form. He had been a child star, a box office king, a symbol of old Hollywood energy, and a living connection to an era that younger viewers only knew through black and white clips. When someone like Rooney sat on Carson's couch, the audience was invited to feel affection before he even opened his mouth. But nostalgia can be dangerous because it softens the edges of people who may not deserve soft lighting. Rooney's life and career were full of chaos: marriages, money problems, career crashes, and a personality often described as overwhelming. The public saw the survivor. Others saw the exhausting ego of a man who had been famous since childhood and never fully escaped the damage of being treated like a product. That is the darker truth behind many Golden Age stars. Some were not born cruel. They were built inside a system that rewarded tantrums, ignored boundaries, and turned children into money machines before they became adults. Rooney could be funny, charming, and heartbreaking, but he could also represent something deeply uncomfortable. A man trapped inside his own legend, still expecting every room to orbit around him. Number 5. Bette Davis. Bette Davis did not need to raise her voice to cut someone down. Her face could do it. Her pause could do it. Her stare could make silence feel like a verdict. That power made her one of the greatest actresses of the 20th century. It also helped build a reputation for sharpness that could feel less like confidence and more like combat. On screen, Davis turned hardness into art. She played women who were wounded, ruthless, intelligent, bitter, proud, and impossible to dominate. But off-screen, the same qualities made her intimidating. She did not suffer fools gently. She did not hide contempt easily. And she came from a Hollywood generation where verbal cruelty was often mistaken for sophistication. That is why Carson's world was such an interesting stage for someone like Davis. Late-night television depends on ease. Davis carried tension. She could be witty, fascinating, and brutally honest, but there was always the sense that one wrong question could turn the interview into a duel. Was she evil? That word may be too simple. But she was dangerous in the way brilliant people can be dangerous when their talent convinces them that ordinary kindness is optional. Number 4. Orson Welles. Orson Welles was not just a guest. He was a monument that talked. By the time he appeared in late-night settings, he carried the weight of Citizen Kane, Radio Panic, unfinished masterpieces, studio battles, and one of the most famous voices in entertainment history. A normal guest answered questions. Welles occupied space. His darkness was not the scandalous kind. It was the darkness of ego, disappointment, and genius that refused to shrink itself for television timing. Carson's show was built on precision. Welles belonged to a universe where stories wandered, rules bent, and the room adjusted to him. That made him fascinating, and probably exhausting. He could turn a short segment into a lecture, a memory, a performance, or a quiet act of domination. When someone has spent a lifetime being called a genius, normal boundaries can begin to look like insults. But Welles also deserves sympathy. Hollywood took much from him. It praised him, fought him, copied him, and then left him struggling for money and control. Still, the warning remains clear. Brilliance does not automatically make someone generous. Sometimes genius enters the room and slowly consumes all the oxygen. Number 3. Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra's charm was almost dangerous because it made power look romantic. The voice, the suit, the cigarette, the confidence, everything about him suggested control. When Sinatra smiled, people leaned in. When he went cold, rooms changed temperature. That is the Sinatra myth. Elegance with a threat behind it. He was adored as a singer, admired as an actor, and feared as a man who seemed connected to forces larger than show business. For decades, stories followed him about temper, intimidation, political influence, and alleged underworld associations. Sinatra denied being part of organized crime, but the shadow stayed close enough that it became part of his legend. On Carson's couch, Sinatra could be funny and smooth. But the darker question is not whether he could entertain. Of course he could. The question is how many people around him felt they had to laugh. That is what separates ordinary celebrity ego from something more chilling. Sinatra did not only represent fame, he represented access, loyalty, pressure, and fear. He made glamour feel powerful. He also made power feel glamorous. And that combination can turn a beloved entertainer into a warning sign. Number 2, Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford understood image like a religion. Every angle mattered. Every outfit mattered. Every gesture had to protect the myth. She had survived silent film, talkies, studio politics, aging, reinvention, and competition from younger stars. By the time she became a late-night guest, she was not simply an actress. She was a carefully guarded monument to discipline. But Crawford's public elegance was later shattered by one of Hollywood's most infamous family stories. Her daughter Christina Crawford's memoir, Mommy Dearest, accused her of abuse, control, emotional cruelty, and terrifying private behavior. Some disputed the book, others believed it, but the image never fully recovered. That is what makes Crawford one of the most haunting names here. Her entire career was built on control, yet the story that defined her after death was about control turning monstrous inside the home. The perfect posture, the flawless makeup, the regal smile. In hindsight, those details became unsettling because they seemed less like glamour and more like armor. Carson's couch was built for charm, but Crawford's legacy asks a brutal question. What if the most polished person in the room is also the most frightening once the door closes? Number 1. Jerry Lewis. Jerry Lewis may be the most disturbing name on this list because his public image depended so heavily on innocence. He played the clown, the overgrown child, the rubber-faced fool whose chaos was supposed to feel harmless. He raised enormous attention for charity and became associated with children, generosity, and sentimental television moments. But later accounts from women who worked with him painted a much darker picture. Several actresses accused Lewis of harassment and abusive behavior during the height of his power. That changed the meaning of the clown mask. Suddenly, the silly faces looked less innocent. The childish persona felt more complicated. The question became impossible to ignore. How often did Hollywood use laughter to protect men who made others uncomfortable? That is why Lewis belongs at number 1. Not because he was the only difficult star. Old Hollywood had plenty of those. But because the gap between his public image and the allegations against him was so wide. The man America was encouraged to see as lovable, wounded, and generous was also remembered by some colleagues as controlling, cruel, and deeply inappropriate. And that is the darkest secret of the Golden Age. The camera did not always reveal character. Sometimes it helped hide it. Johnny Carson's couch looked harmless, but it sat at the crossroads of fame, ego, fear, and performance. These 9 stars remind us that old Hollywood was never as golden as the posters promised. Some legends were brilliant, some were broken, some were cruel, and sometimes the most unforgettable performance happened after the camera stopped rolling.